begged. That is the word. 39 men chose to ignore the night. They watched a woman struck down. The night she begged for the one thing the whole town owed her: help. 40 men were in that saloon. 39 of them found something fascinating in the bottom of a glass. Only one man stood up from the back corner. The one man, the richest cattle baron in the territory, least wanted to see on his feet, and when that man rose, the baron smiled, because he believed he already owned that stranger. He was wrong about that, the way certain proud men are wrong about the one thing that will end them. Her name was Odessa. This is Larkspur Hollow, Wyoming Territory, in the autumn of 1884. And this is the story of a widow who walked into a room full of armed men with nothing but a folder of proof and her own 2 hands. The man who murdered her husband owned the sheriff, owned the circuit lawyer, owned the only newspaper within 60 miles, and had spent 12 years teaching an entire valley the specific practical value of looking away. Stay with this one. Through to the mill at dawn, it is worth the whole hour. If this story is holding you, become a channel member and tap join beside the channel name. Now, let's go back to the beginning, to a Tuesday evening, a leather folder held against a woman's chest, and a saloon that was about to learn what kind of town it actually was. Larkspur Hollow sat in a green fold of the Wind River foothills, a town of perhaps 1,100 souls that had grown up fast and crooked around a stamp mill, a stage stop, and above everything else that mattered, the grazing rights that Silas Barlow had spent a dozen years quietly, patiently. Barlow ran more cattle than the next 4 ranchers combined. He held the paper on half the storefronts along Argent Street, including the bank's own building, which meant the banker answered to him before he answered to any territorial charter. He had put the sheriff in his chair with a word to the right men at the right saloon table, and he had done it so cleanly that most of Larkspur Hollow had simply stopped noticing the water they were swimming in. A town does that given enough years and enough reasons not to look too closely. It learns the shape of its own silence and calls that shape peace. The valley had not always belonged to Silas Barlow, though a stranger riding through in 1884 could be forgiven for assuming otherwise. 12 years earlier, when Barlow had first come north with a modest herd and a hired man or 2, Larkspur Hollow had been a scattered collection of homesteads and small operations, none of them large enough to dominate the others. All of them dependent on the same creek water and the same open range and the same fragile good faith that keeps a young frontier town from tearing itself apart before it has finished being built. Barlow had understood something the rest of the valley had not, that good faith, patiently exploited, is worth more than gold, and that a man willing to be quietly, methodically ruthless for a decade could accumulate an entire county's worth of leverage while his neighbors were still busy being neighborly. He bought up water rights during a dry summer, when smaller ranchers needed cash more than they needed foresight. He backed the right candidates for sheriff and county assessor with money that never quite traced back to him directly. He was, by the plain measure of Larkspur Hollow's ledgers, a generous man. He loaned money freely, at terms that always seemed reasonable in the moment and only revealed their true cost years later, once the borrower had built an entire livelihood on top of a debt he could no longer walk away from. Odessa Cade was 32 years old, dark-haired, quietly and unmistakably beautiful, in the way that made men in that saloon glance twice even on an ordinary Tuesday, though on this particular Tuesday there was nothing ordinary in her face at all. 6 months of grief and 6 months of fighting had worn a certain hardness into features that had once been merely lovely, and the combination of the two, grief and fight both, was harder to look at than either one alone. She wore a plain gray traveling dress, dust on the hem from the walk-in from the mill road, and she carried a leather folder pressed flat against her chest with both arms the way another woman might carry a child. She had not come to that saloon to make a scene. She had come because every legitimate door in Larkspur Hollow had already been closed to her quietly, one at a time, over 6 months of asking, and the saloon was where Silas Barlow held court most evenings and Odessa Cade had run out of other doors. She had grown up 2 valleys over, the middle daughter of a small cattleman who had taught all 3 of his girls to ride and rope and keep their own accounts before he taught them much of anything else, and she had met Emmett Cade at a church social. Careful young man with flour dust, still on his sleeves from the mill his own father had started and never finished. They had married within the year over the mild objections of Odessa's mother, who thought a millwife's life sounded like a great deal of grinding labor for very little return, and had spent the next 11 years proving the objection wrong one honest harvest at a time. Emmett had a habit of talking through his ledgers with her at the kitchen table after supper, not because he needed her arithmetic, though her arithmetic was, in fact, faster and more reliable than his. Neither of them had imagined in those quiet kitchen table evenings precisely how soon it would come to that, or how completely. The rusted spur was doing its usual Tuesday business when she pushed through the door, 40 men scattered across the tables and the bar rail, cigar smoke hanging blue under the lamps, a piano going in the corner that some fool kept trying to play the same 4 bars of a song. The room did not go silent when she walked in, not at first. It simply noticed her, the way a herd notices a change in wind, heads turning without quite committing to a stare. Barlow sat at his usual center table with 2 of his riders flanking him and a third posted near the door out of long habit, a big, comfortable, gray-templed man of 50 with the kind of handsome, weathered face that photographed well for a rancher and told you nothing at all about what lived behind it. He looked up when she crossed the threshold, and something in his expression did not change so much as settle, the way a cat settles when it recognizes a mouse it has been expecting. She walked straight to his table, set the folder down flat in front of him, and did not sit, did not raise her voice, did not do any of the things a smaller woman with a smaller grievance might have done to announce herself. "I know what you did to my husband," she told him. "I have proof. It's all in there." Barlow did not open the folder. He looked at it, and then at her, for a long, unhurried moment, the way a man looks at something he intends to deal with entirely on his own schedule. He leaned forward and said something to her quietly, low enough that not one of the 40 men in that room could later agree on the exact words, though every one of them would agree, if pressed hard enough in private. Then he struck her. It was not a wild, drunken blow. It was deliberate, controlled. The back of his hand catching her across the cheek with the flat, unhurried precision of a man making a point he had made before and expected to make again, and she went down hard against the plank floor, her folder scattering papers across the sawdust, her palm skidding out to catch herself. Blood showed at the corner of her mouth. 40 men watched it happen. 3 of Barlow's riders, one at the bar, one by the sidewall, one at the door, did not so much as shift their weight toward their holsters. Nobody in that room was going to intervene on behalf of a widow against Silas Barlow, and every man in the Rusted Spur, Barlow included, understood that fact as plainly as he understood the weather. He had a badge on his vest that the town had paid for and Barlow had arranged, and when Odessa Cade hit that floor, Sheriff Dunmore looked at his glass, turned it a quarter turn in his hand, and did not look up again. That, more than anything Barlow himself did that night, was the detail Larkspur Hollow would spend years trying not to remember. Not the blow itself, which was ugly but at least honest in its cruelty, but the sheriff's glass, turning slow in lamplight, while a woman bled on the floor 8 feet away. Odessa did not cry out. She lay there a moment with her palm flat against the boards, gathering whatever was left in her after 6 months of exactly this kind of exhaustion, and when she finally lifted her face, it was not toward Barlow. It was toward the room. Toward all 40 of them, the drovers and clerks and off-shift mill hands who filled the Rusted Spur on any given Tuesday, men who knew her by name, men whose wives had brought her stew after the funeral, men who tipped their hats to her on Argent Street in broad daylight, and had every one of them just watched her get struck to the floor without lifting a finger. "Please help," she said, 2 words. Something quieter and harder than a scream. The sound of a woman asking a plain, simple thing of a room full of people who all owed her at least that much, and already half knowing, from the particular quality of the silence that answered her. 39 men looked at their drinks. It happened almost in unison, a small, collective, shameful motion, chins dropping, eyes finding tabletops and glass rims, and some of them would tell themselves later that they'd been weighing their odds, calculating what 3 armed riders and an untouchable rancher might do to a man who stepped forward. Most of them, if they were honest with themselves in the years afterward, would admit there had been no calculation in it at all. It had simply been easier to look away, the way it is always easier, and Larkspur Hollow had been practicing that particular ease for 12 straight years. One man did not look at his drink. He was sitting alone at a back table near the far wall in worn trail clothes, gone the color of dust, a man who had occupied that exact corner most evenings for the better part of 2 months without ever once becoming part of the room's memory of itself, the kind of presence a saloon simply absorbs and forgets. A stranger nobody had bothered to learn the name of, because nobody had thought there was any reason to. He was somewhere in his 40s, lean and still in the particular way of men who have trained themselves out of wasted motion, gray showing faintly at his temples under a hat he wore, pushed back just enough to leave his eyes uncovered. He had a glass of whiskey in front of him that he had barely touched all evening. When Odessa Cade said, "Please help," to a room of men who had already decided not to hear it, this stranger set his glass down without a sound. Barlow saw him rise, and Barlow smiled. It was not the reaction any of the 39 men expected, and it confused several of them badly enough that they finally did look up, if only to see what Barlow found so amusing about a lone drifter. Barlow's smile was easy, unhurried, the smile of a man holding a card he had been saving for exactly this occasion. "Sit down, friend," he said, loud enough now for the whole room to hear. "You've got enough troubles of your own tonight." Because Barlow knew something about that stranger that nobody else in the Rusted Spur knew it with the particular, satisfied certainty of a man who had built the trouble himself, brick by brick 3 years earlier. The stranger did not sit down. He crossed the room instead, unhurried, the crowd parting around him the way a crowd parts around a man who was clearly not asking permission, and he stopped at Odessa's side and crouched down. "Pick up her papers," he said. It was not loud. It did not need to be loud in a room that had gone that quiet. Barlow's two-seated riders came half up out of their chairs at a small motion from their employer, and the stranger's hand moved. Not fast, not dramatic, just certain. Inside his coat, what came out of that coat was not a gun. It was a badge. Worn at the edges, the eagle on it dulled from years against a man's chest, held up plainly in the lamplight where all 40 men, and Silas Barlow most of all, could see exactly what it was. Barlow's smile did not vanish all at once. It simply stopped, the way a clock stops, the muscles of his face holding the shape of amusement for one full second after the amusement itself had already died behind his eyes. A warrant Barlow had bought and paid for 3 years earlier was one thing. A quiet, useful, private kind of leverage he kept in a drawer for exactly this circumstance. A federal badge, produced in front of 40 witnesses in the middle of his own saloon, was an entirely different and far more dangerous kind of arithmetic. And Silas Barlow, whatever else could be said about him, Barlow let them go. That, too, was a decision, not a mercy, and the stranger understood it as exactly that the moment it happened, Barlow calculating, in the space of a breath, that letting a widow and a badge-carrying deputy walk out the front door of the Rusted Spur served him better tonight than forcing a confrontation 40 men would talk about for the rest of their lives. He waved his riders back down into their chairs with 2 fingers, almost lazily, and watched the stranger help Odessa Cade to her feet, gather what papers had scattered across the sawdust, and walk her out through the swinging doors into the cold. He was still smiling faintly when the doors swung shut behind them, and if any of the 39 men in that room had known him even half as well as they believed they did, that small, patient smile should have frightened them a great deal more than the blow had. Outside, under a sky gone hard and clear, with the first real cold of the season, Odessa pulled her arm free of the stranger's grip the moment they cleared the boardwalk and turned to face him. Her hands, when she gathered her papers back into some order, were shaking, though her voice, when it came, was not. "Who are you?" Really, not quite a question. More a demand from a woman who had just watched a stranger produce a federal badge in the middle of the one town where federal authority had apparently never once mattered. "Someone who's been watching Silas Barlow for 8 months, he told her. His name was Holt. He gave her that much on the boardwalk in the cold with the Rusted Spur's piano still limping along behind the closed doors. Not his rank, not his orders, not the particular chain of events that had put him in a back corner of a Larkspur Hollow saloon for 2 straight months nursing the same glass of whiskey most evenings, simply his name offered plainly. The way a man offers the one true thing he has left to give in a moment when everything else about him is still, by necessity, a mystery. He had come into the territory under a federal marshal's quiet instruction to build a case against Barlow's operation. Land fraud, water rights manipulation, a pattern of convenient accidents that had followed Barlow's rise for over a decade. Filling a notebook he kept sewn into the lining of his saddlebag, waiting for the one piece of hard, documented proof that would let him move. He had not expected that proof to walk into a saloon carrying it against her own chest. Holt had come up through the marshal's office the hard way, the way most of the good ones did, starting as a deputy in a border county where the line between lawman and outlaw had been thinner than most territorial charters cared to admit. And he had learned early that the most dangerous men in any county were rarely the ones who carried a gun in plain sight. The dangerous ones carried a banknote or a grazing lease or a friendly word to the right assessor, and they did their damage in daylight, with witnesses, and called it business. Barlow's file had crossed his desk 8 months earlier as a handful of scattered complaints that no single county had jurisdiction or appetite to pursue on its own. A pattern only visible to a man willing to ride between counties comparing notes nobody else had thought to compare. He had taken the case because nobody else wanted it, and because the pattern, once he saw it laid out on his own desk, had bothered him in the particular way that made a man willing to spend 8 months of his life in the back corner of a saloon nursing warm whiskey he had no intention of finishing. "You could have gotten yourself killed in there," she said. "So could you," Holt answered. "You walked in first." She studied him a long moment in the lamplight spilling from the saloon window. This quiet, unhurried stranger who had just risked whatever cover he'd spent 8 months building for a woman he had never once spoken to, and something in her exhausted, grieving, furious chest loosened by a small, careful degree. But the first faint outline of it. "There's more," she told him. "More than what's in that folder. My husband kept records. Careful ones. I've been afraid to show them to anyone, because I didn't know who was safe to show them to." Holt looked back toward the saloon where the piano had finally, mercifully stopped. "Show me," he said. "I've got nowhere else I need to be tonight." The walk out to Cade's mill took the better part of an hour, along a wagon road that followed Larkspur Creek, northeast out of town, past dark fields and the long black shapes of cottonwoods, the cold sharpening as the last of the town's lamplight fell away behind them. Odessa did not talk much on that walk, and Holt did not press her to. He had learned, across 8 months of quiet watching, that people gave up their real truths in their own time or not at all, and pushing too early only taught them to close back up. What she did tell him, in pieces, unhurried, was the shape of the last 6 months, the husband she had buried in the spring, the mill that had been theirs together and was now entirely hers to run alone, the 6 months of doors, closed softly in her face, answered to Silas Barlow before they answered to her. Emmett Cade had built that mill with his own 2 hands over 11 years, a solid stone and timber structure on the near bank of Larkspur Creek that ground grain for half the valley, and had by every honest measure made him one of the few independent men within 30 miles. That independence had made him useful to his neighbors and dangerous to Barlow in roughly equal measure, because a mill owner who couldn't be bought or leaned on was a mill owner who kept honest records of who sold grain to whom, at what price. It had a way of contradicting the version of events Barlow preferred the Territorial Land Office to believe. Emmett Cade had died on a spring morning when the mill's great water wheel, the one he inspected himself every single month without fail, failed under load and threw him against the housing hard enough to break his neck before it ever slowed. The valley had called it an accident. Odessa had called it an accident, too, for the first several weeks, because grief does not leave much room for suspicion, and because a woman burying her husband is rarely looking for reasons to keep bleeding. She led Holt down past the great dark shape of the wheel itself, silent now in the cold night water, and around behind the old grinding wheel housing where a loose stone concealed a shallow cavity Emmett had built years before, for exactly this purpose, a place to keep things a man did not want found by a casual search. From it she drew a thick, careful ledger, bound in oilcloth against the damp, and set it in Holt's hands with the particular reverence of a woman handing over the last real piece of her husband she had left. "He kept this for 2 years," she said, I didn't understand half of it until after he was gone. Then I understood all of it. Holt read it there by the light of a shuttered lantern twice through, and did not say a word until he had finished the second reading. 13 careful pages in a dead man's meticulous hand, laying out grain price manipulation across 3 seasons that had systematically undercut every independent farmer in the valley in favor of Barlow's own holdings. A pattern of land transfer dates cross-referenced against a string of convenient accidents on properties. Fraction of their worth, a column of payments made to the county assessor that correlated almost too neatly with reassessments that had driven 3 separate families off land Barlow wanted. And, on the final page, in a hand that had grown visibly less steady the closer it came to the entry itself, Emmett Cade had documented what he'd found 6 weeks before his death during his own routine inspection of the water wheel's load-bearing support. Engineered to hold under normal use and fail precisely under the kind of sustained load the wheel carried every single day it ground a full harvest through. He knew, Holt said quietly, closing the ledger before it killed him. He knew someone had done this on purpose. He wrote to a lawyer in Laramie the week before he died, Odessa said, asking how a man goes about proving something like this without getting himself killed first for asking the question. I found the letter's carbon copy folded inside the ledger. He never got an answer back. I don't think he had time. They stood together at the base of that silent wheel for a long moment, the cold creek running black beneath it, both of them holding a version of the same understanding that they were looking, now, at more than a widow's grievance and more than a federal deputy's quiet surveillance, that a dead man's own careful hand had already done most of the hardest work of building a case against Silas Barlow, and that the only thing standing between that ledger and a courtroom was the small, considerable matter of Barlow owning every lawyer, every judge. So we have the same enemy, Odessa said, and it wasn't quite a question either, and evidence that works a great deal better together than it does apart, Holt told her. And for the first time since she'd walked into that saloon with her folder pressed against her chest, something in Odessa Cade's exhausted face came very close to hope. They built the plan slowly over the following days, meeting at the mill after dark, careful never to be seen together on Argent Street in daylight, because a federal deputy known to be working with the widow Barlow had already publicly humiliated was a target neither of them could afford to make obvious before they were ready. Holt had spent 8 months quietly identifying 3 people in Larkspur Hollow who had seen enough of Barlow's operation to matter, and were frightened enough to have stayed silent about it, and he set about the slow, patient work of convincing each of them one at a time. Nell Ashworth kept the land transfer records at the county land office, a sharp, careful woman in her 30s who had watched Barlow's men alter transfer documents on 2 separate occasions and had said nothing because saying something meant losing the only decent job available to an unmarried woman in a town Barlow effectively owned. Otis Farrow had worked the mill under Emmett Cade for 6 years before Barlow's foreman quietly bought his silence with a standing offer he'd been too frightened, until now, to refuse. He had seen the load-bearing support before it was cut and after, and knew the difference better than any Inspector Barlow could pay to testify otherwise. Amos Tull farmed 40 acres on the valley's eastern edge and had seen 2 of Barlow's riders at the mill in the week before Emmett Cade died, a detail he had mentioned once, carefully to no one but his own wife, and had regretted mentioning even that much every day since. Holt approached each of them alone at night away from Argent Street and gave each one the same honest offer, rather than a threat, that a federal case was coming whether or not they chose to be part of it, that their testimony would matter a great deal more given voluntarily than dragged out of them later under subpoena, and that he could not promise their safety, only that he intended to do everything in his power to see they were protected once Barlow's operation came apart. Nell Ashworth took 3 days to decide, sitting with the offer the way a careful woman sits with any decision that could cost her a job she genuinely needed. Otis Farrow decided in a single evening, once Holt described exactly what had been found cut on that water wheel support, because Otis had loved Emmett Cade the plane. Uncomplicated way a good hand loves a fair employer, and had been carrying the shame of his own silence longer than he cared to admit. Amos Tull was the hardest to move, a man with a wife and 4 children, who had every practical reason to keep his head down. And it was in the end, not Holt's arguments, but Odessa's own visit to his kitchen table, one woman asking another family plainly what kind of valley they wanted their children raised in. Odessa kept the ledger at the mill through those first days of building the case, and it was there. On a night she sat no more than 20 feet away in the dark, unable to sleep, that Silas Barlow's men broke in and proved just how badly he had already understood the danger he was in. They did not take the ledger. They left it exactly where they'd found it, along with a note in Barlow's own hand, direct and unhurried in a way that told her precisely how little he feared consequence. Sell the mill by Friday, or I bury your husband's name along with yours. 2 days after that, Barlow's lawyer filed a petition in territorial court declaring Odessa Cade mentally incompetent to manage her own affairs, citing her public outburst at the Rusted Spur as evidence of a woman that Barlow had almost certainly begun preparing before she had ever set foot in that saloon. The strike itself calculated in part to manufacture exactly this kind of evidence. The petition gave her 72 hours before the court would appoint an administrator over her property, her mill, and everything Emmett Cade had spent 11 years building. If a story like this is worth your time, become a channel member, tap Join. Right beside the channel name. It costs nothing, and it helps this channel keep telling these stories. No lawyer in Larkspur Hollow would take Odessa's case against Silas Barlow, and the local judge, a soft, comfortable man named Judge Pruitt, who owed his position to Barlow as plainly as the sheriff owed his, could be counted on to rule exactly the way Barlow wanted before either side had finished making its argument. Holt had known this was coming for months. Man does not spend 8 months watching an operation like Barlow's without learning precisely which levers he controls and which ones he doesn't, and he had already, weeks earlier, written a careful letter to a name he trusted more than any other in the territory. A circuit judge with 30 years on the bench and reputation hard-earned across 4 counties, for being a man who could not be bought and did not care for people who tried. That letter had gone out by fast rider before Odessa ever walked into the Rusted Spur, a piece of foresight Holt had allowed himself without fully knowing, yet how urgently it would be needed. The trouble was that Judge Ellery was not sitting in any fixed courthouse. He was on circuit somewhere in the Eastern District, moving between a half-dozen scattered towns, on a schedule that shifted with weather, road conditions, and whatever disputes happened to be waiting for him at each stop, a deliberately inconvenient arrangement that had over 30 years made Ellery nearly impossible for a man like Barlow to quietly influence, and equally difficult for anyone in genuine need to simply find. With 72 hours running against Odessa's mill and everything in it, and no confirmed word yet on where along that circuit Ellery might currently be, Holt made the only decision left to make. He saddled his horse before first light and rode east alone, into country he did not fully know, chasing rumor and stage schedules and the scattered second-hand traces of a moving circuit court, because 35 hours of riding was the only path left between Odessa Cade and losing everything her husband had built. The ride east was long and hard and largely without landmarks worth remembering. A blur of changing horses at way stations, questions asked of stage drivers and telegraph operators, and anyone else who might have crossed paths with a circuit judge in the last week, each answer narrowing the search a little further without ever quite closing it. Holt slept in the saddle in short, dangerous stretches when he had to, and did not sleep at all when the country got rough enough to demand his full attention, and somewhere past the 20-hour mark, in a rail depot, 2 towns over from where he'd started, he finally got word that put a real name to the search, settling a land dispute that had apparently run longer than expected, and was likely still there for at least another day. Holt turned his exhausted horse toward Flat Rock, and pushed on, doing the arithmetic in his head the whole way. 35 hours given, some 20 already spent, the return trip still ahead of him no matter what happened once he found the judge. And Odessa's 72 hours ticking down in Larkspur Hollow, whether or not Holt reached anyone in time to stop it. The country between the depot and Flat Rock ran rougher than anything he had crossed on the first leg of the ride, a stretch of broken hills and dry washes that forced him off the main road twice to avoid ground his exhausted horse could not have managed at speed. And more than once in those last hours he found himself measuring the light instead of the miles, watching the sky for the particular gray that meant morning was closer than his own body wanted to believe. He passed through 2 more way stations without stopping, calling out only long enough to confirm he was still on the right road, and traded his horse a final time at a lonely relay barn run by an old-timer who took one look at the state of him. Somewhere in that last stretch, with the horse beneath him, laboring and his own hands gone numb around the reins, Holt found himself thinking less about Barlow and more about the particular shape of Odessa's face on that boardwalk outside the rusted spur. The thing keeping him upright in the saddle when exhaustion alone would have put a lesser man down an hour earlier. He rode into Flat Rock with 23 hours still left on the clock, dust-caked and half-dead in the saddle, and found Judge Ellery at the town's single respectable hotel, finishing a late supper alone at a corner table with the unhurried patience of a man who had learned long ago, and the rare ones that couldn't would announce themselves plainly enough. Ellery was in his 60s, silver-haired spare, with the kind of steady, unreadable gaze that had presumably made a great many desperate men and a great many corrupt ones equally uncomfortable across 30 years on the bench. He looked up as Holt crossed the dining room toward him, rode filthy and moving with the particular urgency of a man who has run out of time to be polite about an interruption. And something in the judge's expression settled into patient attention rather than annoyance, as though he had developed a fairly reliable instinct for the difference between a man causing trouble and a man carrying it. Holt laid everything on the hotel table without preamble, the ledger, his own 8 months of federal documentation on Barlow's operation, the signed statements he'd already gathered from Nell Ashworth and Otis Farrow before he'd ridden out, and finally, the 72-hour clock now running visibly against a widow 4 counties away, who had no idea whether the man she'd trusted with her one chance at justice would return in time to matter. A woman's mill and everything her husband left her are about to be signed over to an administrator on a filing built entirely to silence her, Holt said. The man behind it killed her husband to get his land, and he owns every judge within a day's ride of Larkspur Hollow, except the one sitting at this table." Judge Ellery read for 2 hours without a single word, working through the ledger page by careful page, cross-referencing dates against Holt's own notes, studying the incompetence petition. Due unhurried thoroughness of a man who understood exactly how much weight his own signature was about to carry and had no intention of putting it anywhere carelessly. The hotel dining room emptied out around them. Somewhere past midnight, Ellery closed the ledger, set both hands flat on the table, and looked up at Holt with the calm, settled certainty of a man who had already made his decision several pages back and had simply been finishing the reading out of thoroughness rather than doubt. "I will ride tonight," he said. They left Flat Rock before the town's own lamps had gone dark, Ellery moving with a stamina that belied his 60-some years. The two of them pushing horses through country Holt had already half-ruined himself crossing once in the other direction, trading fresh mounts wherever a way station allowed it, and riding through the worst hours of the night on nothing but coffee, urgency, and the shared unspoken understanding that arriving even a few hours late in Larkspur Hollow, the country opened and closed around them in the dark, ridgelines rising black against the sky gone hard with early winter stars, the cold biting through coats and gloves both, and somewhere in the long, silent middle stretch of that ride, Holt found himself doing the same arithmetic over and over, counting hours against the mill road, against the courthouse in Larkspur Hollow, against a woman he had known for less than a week, and had already decided, without ever quite admitting it to himself in words, he was not prepared to fail. They reached Larkspur Hollow just before first light. Both men and both horses run nearly to the edge of what they had left to give, and Judge Ellery did not stop to rest before he acted. He went straight to the courthouse, roused the clerk out of bed to open it, and filed an emergency stay on the incompetence petition before the building's own doors had officially opened for the day. A document that Judge Pruitt, Barlow's own comfortable local judge, had no authority whatsoever to override once a circuit judge of Ellery's standing had entered it into the record. By the time Larkspur Hollow's ordinary business hours arrived, the 72-hour clock that had been ticking against Odessa Cade's mill had simply stopped, replaced by a federal stay bearing a signature no local court in that valley could touch. 2. Word of Ellery's arrival reached Silas Barlow within the hour, the way anything of consequence in that town always reached him within the hour, and Barlow, whatever else could be said of the man, did not waste time pretending the ground beneath him had not just shifted. He rode out to Cade's mill himself that same morning, with 2 of his riders behind him, and none of the previous week's smiling patience left anywhere on his face. And Odessa Cade was not a woman inclined to be caught unprepared twice. "Name your price," Barlow said, dismounting slow. Still enough of the old rancher's confidence in his voice to suggest he believed even now that everything eventually came down to a number. "Whatever you think this is worth, I'll pay it, and we'll both be done with this. My husband already paid the price," Odessa told him. She stepped aside from the mill's yard door as she said it, and it swung open behind her to reveal Judge Ellery standing in the doorway with Holt beside him, and an out-of-county Sheriff Ellery had brought along specifically because he trusted no badge currently operating inside Larkspur Hollow itself. Barlow's 2 riders went still. Barlow himself did not run, did not reach for anything, simply stood in his own mill yard with the morning light, coming up gold and ordinary behind him, and understood in the space of a single long breath that every advantage he had spent 12 careful years assembling had just come apart in the space of one bad week. He was arrested where he stood. In the yard of the mill, he had murdered a man to acquire, without a single shot fired, and without a single one of his own riders lifting a hand to stop it, because even Barlow's own men. The hearing came 3 days later, held not in Judge Pruitt's compromised courtroom but in a temporary session. Ellery convened himself with Nell Ashworth, Otis Farrow, and Amos Tull, all called to testify, Amos Tull walking in unannounced on the second morning. That the danger of speaking had finally become smaller than the shame of staying silent. Their testimony, laid alongside Emmett Cade's own 13 careful pages, built a case even Barlow's expensive territorial lawyers could not meaningfully dent. The manufactured robbery warrant that had hung over Holt's name for 3 years, the leverage Barlow had smiled about in the rusted spur, believing right up until the moment the badge came out that it still owned him, collapsed entirely under Ellery's questioning. A paid witness and a cooperative sheriff 2 counties over, both of whom Ellery's own inquiry traced directly back to payments from Barlow's ledger. The warrant against Holt was formally voided in open court. Silas Barlow was bound over for trial at the territorial capital, on charges that would very likely end whatever remained of his freedom for a great many years to come. Sheriff Dunmore resigned before the week was out, and the county land clerk who had helped Barlow alter transfer records quietly left the territory rather than face what Nell Ashworth's testimony had made unavoidable. Larkspur Hollow spent that week doing something it had not done in 12 years, which was talking about Silas Barlow in the open, in daylight, on Argent Street, without lowering its voice. It was not a comfortable conversation for a town that had spent over a decade practicing the specific art of looking away, and there were more than a few men who found themselves avoiding Odessa Cade's eyes on the street in those first days for reasons that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with the particular shame of having once studied a glass of whiskey rather than her face on that Tuesday night in the rusted spur. Nobody said much about it out loud. Some things a town has to carry quietly, working them over slowly, the way Elias Bowen-style men turn a hard stone in a field, deciding over months and years what kind of place they actually mean to be from here on. The morning after the hearing closed, Holt saddled his horse in the gray early light, while the mill wheel behind him turned slow and steady in the current, doing exactly the work Emmett Cade had built it to do, the way it should have been doing all along before anyone decided a man's life was worth less than his land. Odessa came out into the yard to see him off, and she did not ask him to stay, because some part of her had understood almost from the first night on that boardwalk that a man like Holt did not stay. Places he moved through them, doing whatever quiet, dangerous work needed doing, and then he moved on to wherever the next quiet, dangerous work was waiting. What she asked, instead, was simpler. You found the judge in 23 hours. In country you didn't know, with no fixed courthouse to aim for. How? I asked the right people the right questions, Holt told her. He rode north out of Larkspur Hollow that morning, past the mill and the creek and the long gold fields Emmett Cade had worked his whole life to keep, and Odessa stood in the yard and watched him go until he was a small dark shape against the foothills and then nothing at all. That she did not feel the particular hollowness she might have expected. The mill was hers again, cleanly and permanently. No petition hanging over it, no debt owed to the man who had killed her husband to try to take it. The valley had a federal record now, plain and public, of exactly what Silas Barlow had done, and exactly how it had finally caught up with him, and that record would outlast every quiet arrangement he had ever built. She turned back toward the wheelhouse, toward the sound of grain being ground the way it had been ground for 11 honest years, and got back to the work of the day, because that, in the end, was the thing Emmett Cade's ledger had always been fighting to protect, not vengeance for its own sake, ordinary right to keep what you had honestly built. Larkspur Hollow went on being Larkspur Hollow, 1,100 souls in a green fold of the foothills, a town that would spend the coming years rebuilding a great many things Silas Barlow had quietly warped over 12 patient ears, a land office run honestly again under new clerks, a sheriff's office answering to the county rather than to any one man's cattle interests, a courthouse where Judge Pruitt's rulings would be reviewed, and in more than one case, reversed. None of it happened overnight, and none of it happened without the particular discomfort of a town having to look directly at what it had spent over a decade looking away from, but it happened. And every one of the 40 men who had been in the Rusted Spur that Tuesday night, the 39 who had studied their drinks, and the one who had stood carried something forward out of it that no ledger or hearing or warrant could fully account for. The plain, uncomfortable knowledge of exactly what kind of man each of them had chosen to be. The night, a woman on a saloon floor asked a simple thing of a room full of people, and the room, for one long, ugly moment, chose silence. Some towns get the chance to answer that question only once. Larkspur Hollow was fortunate enough, in the end, to get a second chance to answer it better, and it very nearly didn't take it, which is, perhaps, the plainest, truest lesson in the whole of it. That courage rarely announces itself in a crowd, that it usually comes from the one man in the back corner nobody thought to notice, and that the difference between a town that fails a woman and a town that finally stands beside her is sometimes nothing grander than a single person deciding, in a single, unbearable moment,